You're 16 years old, the eldest son of a Maya king. Your entire life, priests have told you the same story: the universe was born from a divine union, a cosmic act where gods mixed seed and blood to tear open the sky and let the world fall out. Sex and sacrifice weren't separate things. They were the same language spoken in different tones. Tonight, it's your turn to speak it. You're standing on the high temple pyramid, above the plaza of your city. Torches hiss in the humid air. Thousands of faces glow below you, turned upward like a field of pale flowers. Beside you, your father, the king, is stripped down to a loincloth. Gold glints on his chest. His face is painted the blue of sacrifice. But it's not his chest the people are watching. In front of him, on a stone tray, lies a stingray spine, obsidian blades, woven bark paper, and a bowl ready to catch blood. You know exactly what will happen. You've seen the carvings. You've watched the priests rehearse the chants. You've heard the older nobles laugh too loudly when they talk about the first time it's your turn. You also know this: no matter how many stories they tell about cosmic duty and divine energy, at the core of this ritual is something brutally simple. Your father is about to slice open his own genitals in front of everyone he rules. Not in secret. Not as private penance. As a public performance, the climax of the ceremony. Kings don't just rule with their minds or their armies here. They rule with their blood, with the most vulnerable parts of their bodies. The priest starts to speak. He reminds the people that the gods bled first, that creator deities tore themselves apart so humans could exist at all. That royal blood, especially blood from the organs of sex, is the closest thing to divine substance humans can offer back. If the king gives that, the gods will give rain, maize, children. Your father kneels. The crowd falls silent in a wave that rolls across the plaza. You don't hear the exact words of the prayer. You're watching his hands. He picks up the stingray spine. The Maya left us a lot of images of this moment: kings bending over with ropes threaded through their flesh, drops of blood falling onto bark paper that would later be burned so the offering could rise as smoke. On carved lintels from Yaxchilan, nobles pierce their tongues with barbed cords. On others, researchers see clear signs that penises were pierced too, the blood shown as strings of glyph-like droplets. To the people in the plaza, this isn't self-harm. It's proof that the king is doing his job. To you, it's something more intimate. It's a preview. Because everyone up here knows what comes next year, or the year after. When your father is too old to keep bleeding, too frail to keep mixing his sexuality and his suffering for the gods, the spine and the paper will be handed to you. The priest raises his arms. The drums stop. For a heartbeat, the only sound is the rasp of your father's breath. He presses the spine down. You look away, not because you're squeamish, but because you're suddenly, painfully aware of your own body. The weight between your legs. The knowledge that it isn't really yours. It belongs to your dynasty. To the gods. To the hungry gaze of thousands. When later scribes and priests talked about these rituals to Spanish missionaries, they described penis cutting with a strange, almost bureaucratic calm. One friar wrote that men hewed at the superfluous part of the penis, leaving the flesh in the form of two floppy ears, a description so crude that Europeans thought they were witnessing some kind of botched circumcision. They weren't. They were watching a royal obligation. Your father doesn't scream. He can't. The whole point of this ritual is that he is in control of his own pain, his own sexuality. That he can turn his body into an altar and his sex into an offering without flinching. This is how he proves he deserves to be the bridge between humans and gods. When the blood begins to fall, the crowd roars, not with lust, but with relief. For another season, the bargain has been renewed. From the outside, centuries later, we talk about Mayan sexual rituals like they were some exotic kink, an ancient empire obsessed with erotic cruelty. The truth is simultaneously smaller and far more horrifying. For the royal families of the classic Maya world, sex was never just private. It was a public resource. A political tool. A cosmic currency paid in sweat and blood. Kings didn't just rule. Queens didn't just marry. Princes didn't just grow up. They were all drafted into a system where their fertility, their genitals, and their most intimate acts were folded into statecraft and theology. Their bodies weren't just theirs, they were infrastructure in the machinery that kept the universe running. The clickbait version of this story shows you lurid thumbnails of orgies and sacred sex rites. The reality is more focused and, in a way, more brutal. The most terrifying sexual rituals of the Maya royals weren't about pleasure at all. They were about obligation. Tonight, as the smoke of your father's burning blood curls into the sky and the crowd chants his name, you feel a hand on your shoulder. An old priest, breath sour with cacao and herbs, leans in and whispers. Next year, little lord. The gods will want your blood, too. You nod, because that's what you're supposed to do. But somewhere deep inside, a quieter voice is asking a question. What happens to a person when every part of their sexuality, their desire, their fear, their pain, is turned into a ritual they can never refuse? Stay with me. Because to understand how horrifying these royal sexual rituals truly were, you have to see how systematic they became, how they tangled together bloodletting, marriage, fertility, and even public humiliation into one tight knot. And like all knots, it started with a loop. The idea that the health of the cosmos was tied to the sex lives and sex organs of a tiny group of royal families. The rest of this story is what happens when you pull that loop tight. The first time they show you the vision serpent, you're still a child. You're sitting in a dim room, staring at a carved stone panel lit by flickering flame. On it, a noblewoman kneels, rope in her hands. She is pulling it slowly through her tongue, each barb invisible but understood. Above her, curling out of a swirling stream of smoke and stylized blood, a great serpent's jaws open, and from its mouth emerges an armored ancestor, fully formed and terrifying. This, the priest tells you, is what your mother does when the kingdom needs answers. You stare at the queen's face in the carving. It is calm. Distant. Focused. You know, abstractly, that she is in agony. Bloodletting rituals, especially among the royal elite, weren't random acts of piety. Studies of Maya inscriptions show that kings and queens performed auto-sacrifice, cutting tongues, ears, and yes, genitals, at almost every major political event, ascensions, war declarations, temple dedications, marriages, births. If kings bled from their penises to fertilize the earth and prove their masculine power, queens bled from their tongues to call the ancestors. It was a division of ritual labor written directly into their flesh. To the Maya, blood wasn't just fluid. It was a medium. Royal blood, and especially blood from parts of the body tied to speech and sex, was a way to feed gods and open portals. In some myths, the gods created humans by cutting themselves, mixing their divine blood with maize. In royal rituals, that story was reenacted over and over, with the royal body as stand-in for the gods. Hey, race where the sexual horror creeps in, quietly. The more charged a body part was, the more it was tied to identity, pleasure, fertility, the more powerful its blood was thought to be. Tongue, speech, promise, names. Genitals, desire, children, lineage. So when a king cut his penis, he wasn't just hurting himself. He was symbolically offering up his ability to produce heirs, his masculinity, his status as lover and father. When a queen shredded her tongue with thorns, she wasn't just enduring pain. She was giving up her voice and her taste, pledging that even her ability to speak and eat existed for the gods first, her own needs second. Archaeologists have found the tools buried in royal tombs: stingray spines, obsidian blades, bone perforators, sometimes stained with microscopic traces of human blood. Hieroglyphic texts refer to sacred blood specifically from the penis, used in rituals that combine public performance with intensely private pain. It's easy to read that and think, well, they were just built different. They didn't see sex the way we do. That's true, and it's not. On one level, pre-conquest Maya sexuality was deeply embedded in ritual discourse. Sex acts were understood in terms of their power to create, sustain, or destabilize society. One influential study of Yucatecan Maya sexuality argues that for them, sexual behavior was always political and spiritual, never purely private. But the bodies were still human. The king still felt the sting of the spine. The queen still felt the barbs rake through her tongue. The smell of blood and sweat still clung to their skin afterward. What made it horrifying wasn't just the pain. It was the total lack of escape. You couldn't decide not to participate. Refusing to bleed for the gods was refusing to be royal, refusing to do the job the cosmos itself had allegedly hired you for. If you're a prince growing into your role, this means your first sexual feelings are tangled up with fear of the day your genitals become public instruments of ritual. Your sense of manhood is measured not just by performance in bed, but by how calmly you can lacerate yourself before an audience. Your relationship to pleasure is fundamentally unstable because the same body part that gives you it is repeatedly associated with pain for everyone else's sake. And it doesn't stop with cutting. Some sources, especially those from the colonial era, describe how the blood from penis bloodletting was collected on cloth or bark paper and then burned, the rising smoke depicted as serpents or visions in art. In some cases, the blood is explicitly linked to fertility symbols, maize, rain, copulating deities, suggesting that royals saw these rituals as a kind of sacrificial ejaculation, an offering of sexual power without the act itself. Think about what that does to your mind if you're born into it. Every time you're aroused, you're reminded that what the gods really want from that energy is not your pleasure, but your suffering. Every time someone talks about heirs, you're reminded that the same organ meant to produce them is also a sacrificial valve you're expected to open on command. And all of this is wrapped in ceremony, incense, and applause. On some nights, the rituals are more controlled, done inside palaces, witnessed by a narrower circle of nobles. On others, especially in big cities, they unfold on massive plazas and temple stairs designed precisely to focus attention on the royal body. The state, as some anthropologists put it, was a theater state, held together by elaborate performances of power in which sex, blood, and spectacle were intertwined. You don't have to imagine it entirely. The art shows you. Kings dancing with blood streaming from their genitals, droplets stylized into neat rows of glyphs. Queens kneeling as ropes thread through their tongues, while serpents of vision curl above them, spitting ancestors and gods from their jaws. Phallic monuments in some sites that exaggerate the male sex into towering symbols, broadcasts of virility carved in stone. For the royal families wrapped in this, the line between ritual sex and ritual violence is almost impossible to draw. There's no category of intimacy untouched by obligation. The moment you're old enough to understand what sex is, you also understand. Your first child will be a political event. Your marriage will be a ceremony orchestrated for cosmic timing. Your most private parts are public property whenever the calendar or the priesthood demands it. People sometimes ask, were there actual rites of ritual intercourse, sacred sex ceremonies where royal couples were expected to perform acts in specific ways, at specific times? The evidence here is thinner, and that, in itself, is part of the horror. We have songs from Zitbalch that describe young women and virgins dancing naked under the moon as part of fertility ceremonies, carrying flowers and offerings. The nudity is ritualized, not pornographic, but it shows that the bodies of the young, especially those tied to reproduction, were put on public display in the name of cosmic renewal. We have myths and iconography linking maize, rain, and human sexuality, where deities engage in cosmic unions that parallel human coupling. We have colonial reports that talk about pre-conquest sexuality as fluid, powerful, and tightly woven into religious life. What we don't have is a step-by-step handbook that says, on this date, the king must sleep with the queen in this exact position while the priests chant. That kind of explicit pornography of ritual is mostly a modern fantasy. But here's the thing. For the people living it, you didn't need a handbook to feel trapped. You just needed to know that your blood was expected on certain days. Your fertility was monitored and commented on. Your marriage bed, whether watched or not, was never truly private, because its results, pregnancy or lack of it, were everyone's business. From a distance, it's easy to talk about royal auto-sacrifice like it's just another entry in a textbook. Up close, it's a lifetime where every erection and every drop of blood feels like a referendum on the fate of the world. And the system didn't stop at the edge of the marriage bed. It shaped how royal couples met, how they were paired, and how their sexuality was woven into statecraft long before they ever touched each other. That's where we're going next. You're not a prince this time. You're a princess. Not the Disney kind. The classic Maya kind, which means your worth has been calculated since birth in lineage, alliances, and the shape of the glyphs that spell your name. From the moment you first bled, not for the gods, but from your womb, the palace women started watching you differently. The midwives whispered calendars. The priests whispered omens. Your mother whispered that you should never forget, your body is a bridge. In Maya royal courts, daughters of noble lineages were diplomatic tools as much as beloved children. Marriages between city-states tied together alliances, settled wars, and legitimated new kings by giving them wives with prestigious bloodlines. But unlike some other empires, the Maya didn't separate this political function from the cosmic one. When your wedding is arranged, it's not just scheduled for a convenient moment. It's scheduled for a richly significant day in the sacred calendar, a date whose combination of numbers and day signs is interpreted as favorable for fertility, royal continuity, and balance between worlds. The union of two lineages is also the union of two sets of patron deities, two chunks of sacred time. You're told, repeatedly, that if this goes well, if you conceive at the right time, if your first child is healthy and male, if you perform your roles properly in the public ceremonies, your body will literally help keep the cycles of rain and maize turning. No pressure. On the night before the wedding, the midwife and older women of the court prepare you. They rub your skin with scented oils. They paint designs on your face and hands. They talk about the obligations of a royal wife, when to stand beside your husband on the temple stairs, when to kneel behind him while he bleeds, when to perform your own bloodletting. They talk about sex mostly in metaphors, plowing, sowing, the meeting of sky and earth. But beneath the metaphors is something harder. They remind you that if you don't conceive, or if you miscarry too many times, the priests will not blame the gods. They will blame you. Fertility rituals in Maya culture weren't limited to kings bleeding on temple tops. They extended into household ceremonies, village observances, and, in royal households, into an almost constant scrutiny of the queen's body. We know from later sources and comparative studies that Maya societies marked women's reproductive lives with rituals, pregnancy blessings, midwife-performed ceremonies, purification rites after birth. In some accounts, pregnant women underwent repeated massages and rituals to keep the fetus in proper position, and were partially secluded as their condition advanced. For queens, this kind of attention was amplified. Your pregnancy is not just your own. The timing of your swelling belly is used as a sign that the gods approve of your husband's reign. The sex of your child carries implications for future alliances and wars. Even your pain in childbirth becomes narrative material for court poets and priests, who link it to mythic patterns of sacrifice and rebirth. And it's not just motherhood. Some rituals, as preserved in later texts like the Book of Songs of Tzitbalch, talk about groups of young women and virgins dancing naked or scantily dressed under the moon, carrying flowers and offerings in ceremonies linked to love, fertility, or agricultural cycles. It's hard to say exactly how often or how widely such rituals were performed, but they show that female bodies, especially youthful ones, were integrated into public performances of eroticized fertility. If you're a royal girl from a prestigious lineage, that might mean being expected to participate in moonlit dances whose symbolism you only half understand. Having older nobles watch not just with aesthetic appreciation, but with the cold eye of alliance building. Knowing that the way your body moves in ritual now will soon be mirrored in a marriage negotiated by people who care more about your father's politics than your own desires. Again, this isn't porn. It's not sensual in the way modern people think about erotic dance. It's scarier than that. Because the rituals aren't designed for your pleasure. They're designed to fold your sexuality into a system where every gesture is simultaneously an offering to the gods, a message to other cities, and a signal to the common people that the royal line is fertile and under control. You might find joy in some of it. You might even find love. Royal couples weren't robots, and some inscriptions hint at real affection between certain kings and queens. But the structure doesn't care how you feel. It cares that you bleed when the priest says bleed. You conceive when the calendar says conceive. You stand where the icons say stand. In this world, the horror of sexual ritual isn't just in bloody knives and barbed ropes. It's in the invisible disciplines. The way you learn to regulate your face at ceremonies so no one can read your fear. The way you schedule your intimate life around auspicious days and priestly advice. The way your body becomes a walking glyph that everyone else feels entitled to interpret. Meanwhile, beneath the limestone pyramids and carved palaces, the earth itself is sprouting stone phalluses. Literally. And the men around you are being taught that their own bodies are pillars holding up the cosmos. That's the next layer of this story. If you walk the ruined cities of the Maya today, you'll see them. Stelae of kings towering over plazas, carved with elaborate costumes and hieroglyphs. But in some places, you'll see something stranger. Standalone phallic monuments, stone shafts carved in ways that deliberately, unambiguously evoke the male sex. At certain sites in Yucatan, recent research shows these phallic sculptures played a role in expressing ideas about masculinity, fertility, and power among the elite. They're not random jokes in stone, they're ritual objects. To modern eyes, they look like an invitation to crude humor. To the people who lived with them, they were reminders. The phallus wasn't just about sex. It was about agriculture, rain, and war. Across Mesoamerica, scholars have noted that phallic imagery often appears in contexts tied to fields, water, and sky. The erect organ doesn't just represent male desire, it represents the creative power that makes crops grow and lineages continue. In some regions, there are even accounts, though fragmentary and hotly debated, of rituals where male masturbation or simulated ejaculation was framed as an offering to encourage rainfall and fertility. For Maya royals, this symbolism was heightened. Your virility was not a private matter. It was something carved, sung, and expected. If you're a young king standing in front of a phallic monument dedicated by an ancestor, heres what's implied. You are expected to match or exceed his ability to produce heirs. You are expected to project strength in war that parallels the potency implied by the monument. You are expected to bleed from your own phallus when the priests call for it, renewing the same cycle he once did. The horror here isn't in orgies or wild sex feasts, as some sensational accounts imagine. It's in the equation. Genitals equals field equals weapon equals altar. Lose one, lose them all. Some anthropologists argue that in parts of pre-conquest Mesoamerica, sexuality among warriors, including same-sex relationships, cross-dressing, and ritualized erotic bonds, was woven into ideas about courage and cohesion. While the evidence for this is stronger in some cultures than others, there are hints that Maya elites, too, saw sex and gender performance as malleable tools for reinforcing hierarchy and group identity. Imagine growing up as a royal boy in that environment. The older warriors joke about their exploits. Priests make oblique references to favors owed to certain gods. The ball game, a ritual sport with deep symbolic connections to life, death, and the underworld, is described in terms that blur the line between competition, sacrifice, and sexual metaphor. No one gives you a clear manual. What they do give you is a constant lesson. Your body, and how you use it in sex, in pain, in public, is part of a larger choreography. If you deviate from the steps the priests and elders expect, if you love the wrong people, refuse the wrong ritual, fail to perform your masculinity in the sanctioned ways, you don't just risk gossip. You risk cosmic disorder. It's not that they didn't have private pleasures. Oils, herbs, and suggestive art tell us that elites knew how to enjoy themselves when they wanted to. In some places, archaeologists find murals and ceramics with explicit scenes of intercourse, often stylized but unmistakable. Yet even these seem to emphasize procreation, myth, or power more than personal, romantic love. And always, threading through the background, is auto-sacrifice. You can't separate your sense of masculinity from the knowledge that at key moments, you will cut yourself where you feel most vulnerable. You will bleed in front of people whose respect matters. You will be judged on how well you turn that act into a show of control, not a collapse into pain. By the late Classic period, as some kingdoms grew more centralized and war more intense, bloodletting among the elite may even have intensified, with rulers staging increasingly elaborate displays to prove their legitimacy. One study of hieroglyphic texts shows patterned spikes in references to royal bloodletting during periods of political stress, as if, when things got shaky, kings responded by putting their bodies ever more violently on the line. That's sexual horror of a very specific kind. Not voyeuristic. Not lurid. Systemic. You, as a royal, inherit a body that is never just yours. The phallus carved in stone, the bloodletting kit buried with your ancestors, the myths linking semen to rain and blood to maize, all of it tells you the same thing. Your sex is civic infrastructure. Your pleasure is irrelevant. Your pain is expected. But perhaps the most chilling element of all is this. We don't actually know the full extent of these rituals. Because when colonizers arrived, they didn't just conquer cities. They rewrote the story of sex itself. When Spanish friars and conquistadors reached the Maya world in the 16th century, they found rituals that horrified them. Human sacrifice. Bloodletting. Nakedness in certain ceremonies. Fluid ideas about sexual behavior that didn't match Christian norms. They responded the way empire usually does, by burning what they didn't understand. One bishop in Yucatan famously ordered piles of Maya books, bark paper codices filled with hieroglyphs about gods, rituals, astronomy, and probably sexuality, to be destroyed, calling them works of the devil. Only a handful survived. That means everything you've just heard, all the horrifying sexual obligations of royal families, the penis bloodletting, the tongue-cutting queens, the fertile brides, the phallic monuments, is stitched together from what little is left. Stone carvings on temples and lintels. Buried tools with microscopic traces of blood. Colonial reports filtered through missionary disgust. Fragments of songs and myths that slipped through the net. We can see enough to know this. For Maya royal families, sex was not dirty or hidden. It was sacred, dangerous, and publicly managed. Kings cut their genitals to fertilize the cosmos and prove their right to rule. Queens shredded their tongues to summon ancestors and legitimize dynasties. Young nobles' bodies were displayed in dances and marriages carefully timed to the sacred calendar. Phallic stones and sexual imagery reminded everyone that masculinity, war, and fertility were intertwined. What we don't see are the parts that were deemed too threatening to leave intact. Some modern scholars, working from hints in surviving texts and later ethnography, argue that pre-conquest Maya sexuality was more accepting of non-heteronormative behavior than colonial authorities would ever tolerate. More intertwined with visionary practices, possibly including psychedelics, than the surviving art can show clearly. More flexible in its understanding of gendered roles and bodies, especially among priests and ritual specialists. If that's true, then the sexual rituals of the royal families may have been even more complex, even more deeply woven into identity, than we can prove now. And that leads to the final horror. We can't ask them. We can't interview queens about what it felt like to bleed for visions, or kings about how their first genital auto-sacrifice changed their relationship to their own desire. We can't ask princesses whether the moonlit dances felt empowering or humiliating, whether arranged marriages brought joy or dread. All we can do is stand in the plazas they once filled, look up at the temples where they once bled, and imagine. But before we romanticize them as exotic victims, remember this. They weren't just suffering inside a system. They were running it. Maya royal families were both prisoners and architects of their sexual rituals. They believed, or convinced themselves, that mixing sex, blood, and power in these ways kept the sun rising and the crops growing. They used their own bodies as propaganda, turning their pain into spectacle to convince commoners and rival cities alike that they were closer to the gods. They passed these expectations down to their children, raising new generations to see their own sexuality as a tool of rule. So when we talk about the most horrifying sexual rituals of the Maya royal families, the point isn't to gawk at them as freaks. The point is to see what happens when a culture decides that the cosmos depends on the suffering of a tiny group of people's most intimate parts. A ruling class decides that their bodies, including their genitals, belong more to the state and the gods than to themselves. Sex becomes so entangled with duty that pleasure, consent, and privacy barely have language left to stand on. If that sounds distant, it shouldn't. Because the patterns are familiar. States and religions still try to regulate who can have sex with whom, when, and how. Leaders' fertility, marriages, and sexual behavior are still treated as public property, fodder for myth and scandal. People's bodies are still turned into battlegrounds where larger cosmic or political struggles are fought. The Maya royal families simply took those patterns to an extreme, carving them into stone and flesh in ways we can still see, centuries later. Somewhere, in a museum or a dark corner of an excavation, there's probably another piece of the story sitting in a box. A broken panel showing a ritual we don't yet understand. A painted scene where sex, blood, and divinity come together in a pattern we haven't fully decoded. Maybe it shows a ritual we'd find even more disturbing than anything described here. Maybe it shows tenderness in a place we expect only brutality. We don't know. What we do know is this. For the ancient Maya royal families, there was no such thing as a purely private sex life. Every desire, every drop of blood, every act, or refusal, was measured against gods, ancestors, and hundreds of watching eyes. And that, in the end, is the most horrifying part of all.